Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Jeremy Ryan Slate, Slate. It's how you spell his last name. And he wears a lot of different hats. We're talking the pre-show. He runs a business. His website is Command Your Brand, and also he has a website with his full name, Jeremy Ryan Slate. But he also has a podcast, so he's kind of like jack of many trades or a king of many trades. I don't really know, but he does a lot of different stuff. I saw him, I think, on Tinfoil Hat talking about Augustus. I saw the faceplate or one of the other kind of big podcasts out there, and then I saw his name come across my desk, so I reached out to his scheduler. So I'm glad to have him. He is the host of the Jeremy Ryan Slate Show, and he studies the highest performers in the world. He studied literature at Oxford University. He also holds a master's in early Roman Empire propaganda from Seton Hall University. His podcast was named the #1 podcast to listen to by Inc. magazine, as well as top 40 under 40 by Podcast Magazine. And like I stated earlier, he and his wife Brielle co-founded Command Your Brand, a new media public relations agency designed to help entrepreneurs share their message by appearing as guests on podcasts. He resides in Stillwater, New Jersey, where he raises chickens and is a former competitive powerlifter. And we're going to talk about the Roman Empire, kind of apply it to our current day, like immigration, inflation. So, Jeremy Ryan Slate, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, William. I'm stoked to hang out. I'm here in the part of New Jersey where it's kind of more like living in Ohio or Pennsylvania or something like that. We like to call this area Pennsyltucky. And it's not like what people expect out of New Jersey. I live on almost 5 acres. I have 24 chickens. I have a 150-pound pig, a bunch of dogs, and my wife and I have 3 little girls. So it's, I guess, kind of an interesting place to be in the world, and not like the rest of the state at all.
Yeah, I heard there's, Jersey has a lot of different kind of little micro areas, is my
Yeah.
understanding. A lot of people outside the state wouldn't know that. Urban, close to New York City, and then kind of the rural outlook. I mean, it's kind of an enviable thing to kind of live in the sticks on 5 acres. I think that's kind of, at least people in my circle, that's kind of our dream, is to be closer to the earth.
Well, it's
How
nice
long
to
have
be
you
able to
lived
walk
like
out
that
to
now?
your small barn every morning and get 8 to 10 eggs. It's always
Nice.
it's always a good morning, man.
Yeah, especially you could leverage that into like a multi-million dollar career. Seeing as how
Especially the
expensive
price of
eggs are.
eggs now,
Yeah,
man.
right. Right. You have a great background, like an academic background, your interest in the Roman Empire, and they're kind of like, that is the meme that's around, is like,
Yeah.
people, what's he thinking about? And the guy's thinking about the, rise and fall, or the fall of the Roman Empire. And a lot of people are thinking that, looking at it kind of the kind of urban areas of the United States and all the chaos and everything that's going on. It's like we're kind of in a different civilizational phase. Like I'm
Yeah.
56, so it's very different from when I was growing up. But that kind of goes back to the popularity of the intro. I think there's really is always going to be a general interest in the Roman Empire and the fall of the Roman Empire. Maybe you
Mhm.
can talk about your academic background
Yeah.
and like how you got interested and what's going on with your research.
So for me, honestly, I've taken a very different look at the Roman Empire than the way people typically look at it. And I think to kind of back things up, it's kind of important to understand, what was Rome as a civilization, because I think people have this idea of emperors and they're, oh, Julius Caesar being the first emperor. He wasn't. So there's a lot of things people know and don't know. And part of it's education, honestly. After for the Industrial Revolution, a lot of how we were educated changed. And these things in the 18th and 19th century would have been a big part of the everyday education of a schooled person, but it just doesn't really happen anymore. So it's a culture that's kind of dropped out in a lot of ways. So for me, I've always been somebody that's been enthralled with history. I've always been really, really interested. And, I have to thank my parents for that. I was reading, things like Robinson Crusoe and et cetera at a very young age. I was reading Tom Clancy books at 11 years old. So I've always been somebody that has had a really big literary side and a big historical side to me. I went to Seton Hall University here in New Jersey for my undergrad degree, and I studied 2 different things. I was a double major in Catholic theology and then also Judaism. And apparently you should like plan out your college education. I end up with a double major purely because they're like, hey, if you take this one more class, you could be a double major. And apparently I was 2 classes short of a triple major. So that was what my undergrad degree looked like. Then I did a program in Catholic literature at New College, Oxford, where we studied the works of Chesterton, Lewis, a lot of things like that. I got to go to the bar that Chesterton and Lewis used to frequent called the Eagle and Child in Oxfordshire. Got to spend some time on Lewis's estate. So it was a really interesting experience. And then I came back and did my master's. Funny enough, most universities, and mine included, are getting rid of classics programs. Classics are where Rome and Greece and the actual languages of Latin and Greek would fall. So what I ended up doing is I had read this really weird article that was written around the year 1900 about Augustus after the Battle of Actium. And Actium is kind of this pivotal point when Rome goes from being a republic to an empire. He goes to Alexandria and he prays in front of the sarcophagus of Alexander the Great, who at that point in time had been dead for almost 300 years. I'm like, that's really weird. Why did he do that? So I had this really interesting way of looking at it. And Augustus was actually able to look at the life of Alexander, the life of Pompey, and the life of Julius Caesar, and kind of create this blueprint on how you propagandize somebody to create more power for yourself without actually having people realize you're doing it, which is a really interesting sort of way he did things. So I went to the dean of the history college and I'm like, so you don't offer the program I want. What I'd like to do is bring all of these classics professors into your history school, and we're going to do it this way. They agreed because they were really interested in the subject. And for me, that was my door into Rome, was really my graduate studies. In terms of what I've looked at in the last few years, getting back to how I got here, Rome is a few periods in time. That was the point I started making. It's founded in 753 BC as a kingdom. There's 7 traditional kings. It becomes a republic in 509 BC. And then it goes till around 31 BC, 23 BC, definitely, it becomes an empire. And the first emperor being Augustus. Traditionally, if you're looking at kind of the Edward Gibbon decline and fall of the Roman Empire side of things, the Western Empire falls in 476, and that's often seen 476 AD, and that's often seen as the traditional fall of Rome. Now, the thing people often ignore is if you look at what we call the Byzantine culture, the Byzantine culture is actually just the Eastern Roman Empire, which there's this big split between East and West that happens in the 280s under Diocletian, and it's really finalized in the early 300s under Constantine, but they would have seen themselves as Romans, right? They would have seen themselves really, the way it's governed is very different. It was more like a medieval kingdom, but to them, they would have seen this as Roman civilization continuing. And that's why in 800, when Charlemagne is crowned to be the first Holy Roman Emperor, the Roman Emperor in Constantinople went like, what the heck? I'm still around. Who's this guy? Right. So I think it's just an important thing to understand of like what Roman civilization is as a whole. So oftentimes when people are looking at how our society is doing, the thing that's very often pointed to, and Time Magazine did this a couple years ago, is they look at the fall of the Roman Republic, right? Like, how does a republic become an empire? And I think it's often because they want to take modern political figures and say, well, this person is Julius Caesar and this person is this character. It's more of a propagandistic way of handling things. So if you look at where we are modernly, I think honestly, we're showing a lot more symptoms of what happened to Rome later in its empire. If you look at what happens in the 3rd century, the 3rd century being the 200s, right? And the really interesting part about it, William, is there's kind of this, I don't know how else to put it, but a superstorm happening right now where the political system is showing kind of the symptoms of how a republic falls, but the economic system and everything else is showing the symptoms of how an empire falls. So we have this really interesting situation happening at the same time. But in my opinion, the actual republic fell a very long time ago. The place I like to pinpoint, and I know a lot of other libertarians like to point to as well, is the year 1913, because 1913 is very pivotal for a lot happens that year, but 3 very particular things. The first being the 17th Amendment, where the state legislatures no longer selected senators. So now everything became by popular vote and we became more of a direct democracy. So people had representation, states no longer did, right? And I think during the pandemic, this was very obvious of what the federal government was able to do and not do, because there isn't really a representation for state legislatures. The other two things that happen is your income tax amendment, and then also the Federal Reserve Act, which gets passed over the Christmas holiday when nobody's actually there to really vote on it. So those three things really start to take away a lot of the functions of a republic. And what ends up happening is you can look at the power of the presidency since 1913, and it starts pulling more and more and more power to itself, right? It becomes more of this imperial type of a post where it has a lot more power now than the other three branches of government. But the caveat to that is, if you look at in the Roman Empire, the people that were responsible for protecting the emperor are known as the Praetorian Guard. And the problem we have is our, for lack of a better term, our deep state, our intelligence state has become more like a Praetorian Guard. So we do have a lot of those functions happening right now where they may be working for or against our, in this case, elected emperor, right?
It really is true. For people who don't know Roman history, the Praetorian Guard sometimes stepped in and
they killed 17 emperors that we can account for.
Right. So like our deep state, whatever you want to call it, CIA, FBI, military, they've done some, we can talk JFK's the 63rd anniversary is 2 months away now. And some of these other things are clearly, what happened to Trump and some of this other stuff is almost like the Praetorian Guard turning on the king. Yeah.
Well, and you can see as well, this was kind of more obvious. So the guy that's in charge of the Praetorian Guard, his name is the Praetorian Prefect, and he would be kind of, aside from the emperor, the most powerful person in Rome. And what ended up happening is that position started to have a lot of influence on who becomes emperor. And I think in the last election, I had written a thread about this. You look at kind of how suddenly Kamala Harris is the candidate. To me, it kind of felt like Obama was kind of being our Praetorian Prefect in a lot of ways. He had selected who the person was going to be, got rid of the one he didn't want, and everybody was waiting on him either endorsing or not endorsing. That was a kind of a really big component of it. So that's the Republic side of things, right? Like, I really see us being more in an empire phase. If you want to look at where we are in history, the crisis of the 3rd century, which goes from 238 AD to, I think it's 284 is around where it ends, this with the rule of Diocletian. There's a really long road to get there, right? And the things that are different in the 3rd century is you have in 193, Commodus, who's the son of Marcus Aurelius, dies. Marcus Aurelius is the last of what are called the 5 good emperors. They're called such because they had a different pattern for how they selected the next emperor. They would take the next closest qualified person to them and name that person their successor. Whereas the Julio-Claudians and the Flavians before that would just pick their natural-born son. Now, in their defense, none of them really had natural-born children to be the next person. And you can get into a whole lot of things of why that was. You have Emperor Hadrian that had a male lover that was very well known, so obviously they're not going to be having kids, right? But what ends up happening is they select that next qualified person. So that works really well for from around 98 to around 190 to 180. So it's a very stable period, almost 100 years. The thing that Marcus Aurelius changes is, number one, he had a natural-born son, Commodus, and it would have been really weird to people for him to not name his son. And also it would have been sowing the seeds of revolution, right? Like, okay, well, why am I not emperor? I actually was next in line. So he changes the process and names his son Commodus to be the next emperor. And the historian Cassius Dio says about this that Rome went from an empire of gold to one of rust with the ascension of Commodus in this way. And he bankrupts the empire. He's more interested in being a gladiator than actually ruling. He's extremely paranoid, so he's constantly concerned that people are trying to knock him off. And so a lot of his policies are about torturing the Senate and going after people that may be trouble for him. So when he dies in 193, the empire changes dramatically. There's a lot of things that change. So you have this empire that, and if I'm going on too long, William, just let me know.
No, please continue.
It's really rather a long-winded thing. But the thing that's different with the death of Commodus is how power is achieved and held. You have the next emperor is a guy named Septimius Severus. He's North African. He would have been from somewhere near like Algeria or that, it's etc. He's the first of what are called the barrack emperors. Barrack meaning military barracks. And what ends up happening is it's whoever has the biggest army is the next emperor, right? Because, I have all the swords, I have everything else. Good luck stopping me. So he starts to change policies in how the soldiers are compensated. He doubles the pay. His son, Caracalla, is going to triple their pay. So this ends up happening, and it creates this really bad inflationary problem. So the thing I'll say about the 3rd century is we don't have senators and congressmen raising armies against each other. We don't have that. The vehicles that we're using to cause inflation and other issues are a little bit different, but we have the same central problems. So the problems in the 3rd century are this inflationary issue, which is created by extreme need to pay the military. It's also compounded by one of the things that allows Roman civilization to rise in the way it did is they had this perfect climate. It goes from about 200 BC to around 200 AD. It's called the Roman climate optimum because Rome had a policy of feeding all of their citizens. Like it was really important that they made sure everybody was fed. As this climate optimum changes, there becomes less and less grain to feed people. So they start importing from places like Egypt. But then Egypt, the Nile Delta would flood every year and create a great growing period. That stops happening around 250. So there's a real need for grain. So grain doubles, triples, quadruples. So now you have more of a need for money. And the solution ends up being for these emperors to basically debase their currency, add other metals to their currency that makes it less valuable. So you're going to have a silver coin from the time of Augustus that's about 95% pure. So we're talking around the 1st century to the late 3rd century. That same coin is about 5% pure. And people would have been very aware of the lack of buying power of their money. So that's one problem. You also have this weak central power problem because each new emperor was either being assassinated by his own people or killed by the next person that wanted to be emperor. So in the 3rd century crisis, which is 238 to 284, you have around 50 different guys claim to be emperor in just that period alone. Wow. And that's only ones that we can track. There was something I was reading recently, they found a small batch of coins minted by an emperor nobody's ever heard of. And we realized that there's probably another one. So there's very hard to actually know how many people were emperor. So this central power is very weak. Now, if your power comes to the military, one of the biggest things you need is a big army, right? And Rome in the time of Marcus Aurelius goes through something that's called the Antonine Plague. And around 10% of the population of Rome dies. So you have this need for soldiers, and Rome had always had, to some extent, and even Caesar did it, barbarians serving in the Roman army. Like this was something that was done. Their auxiliaries were called the foederati. And what ends up happening is the foederati increases in size, but then what ends up happening is the barbarians start being brought into the actual legions, where the legions now start becoming less and less Roman. So then,
I've heard the same thing. The Praetorian Guard, a lot of them were Germans too. Like
this is very true. This is very well. Even Julius Caesar's personal guard were Romans. They were Germans. They weren't Romans. So that is something that had a precedent, like it was happening, but it starts to happen at a higher and higher and higher rate because now there's this need for men, there's this need for money, and one hand kind of washes the other. Because the more men you need, the more money you need, and the money gets in worse condition, right? The emperor after Septimius Severus, the emperor that follows Commodus, his son Caracalla, who's actually portrayed very poorly in the new Gladiator movie. They make him this weird little blonde man with gold teeth. He actually would have been much darker skinned since he would have been North African. He would have been closer to Semitic. In 211 AD, he passes this policy to give citizenship to all free people in Rome. He does it because he wants to be able to tax their inheritance, but now you're responsible for feeding those people, and it also increases the cost of the empire. So around 30 million people with just one proclamation, become citizens of Rome. So this empire is just changing dramatically. And
It's diluting or changing
yeah,
the whole tenor. Yeah.
right. So if you want to look at it, your three core problems are inflation. You have this immigration problem because we're not controlling borders and they're making agreements with tribes that they're not keeping. So then those tribes get upset and start to invade Rome. You would also have a guy be a Roman general one day and he'd be a barbarian general the next day, like Alaric that sacks Rome in 410. So you have these three core problems that are destroying Rome of immigration, inflation, and poor central power. Now, as I said, we don't have congressmen and senators physically attacking each other, but we do really have a real central power issue now. Is kind of our Praetorian Guard deep state has taken a lot more power, and we do have an inflation and immigration problem. Those are two things that start to destroy an empire. And if you look at how Rome falls apart, I think very often historians look at it differently than how it actually happened. And honestly, I'll say a lot of this is my opinion because historians will fight me tooth and nail on what is actually true. But if you look at the last around 100 years of Rome, we're talking leading up to 476, the people actually in charge are adolescents, weak men, children. The final emperor is a boy emperor. I think he's around 13, Romulus Augustulus. And they're propped up by barbarian generals, right? The final emperor is propped up by this guy named Odoacer. And when in 476, Odoacer doesn't kill the last Roman emperor, he retires him and basically says, there's no more emperors, I'm the king of Italy. So if you look at how it happens, people will serve the dollar until the dollar doesn't have power. Well, and then they don't really need that civilization anymore, right? And I think that's what you're really looking at and how Rome crumbled. I apologize for the long-windedness of that.
No,
but there's a lot of pieces
the
to really
parallels are there for today. Like these are
Yeah.
warnings from history, example one or whatever. See how the Rome slowly lost its kind of centralizing function and its core kind of outlook and things like that, all the way from Romulus and Remus, supposedly. It's interesting that the last emperor is also Romulus. It's like a bookend, like the so-called the people.
But that would have been for a reason, by the way, because here's the thing you have to understand. And when you look at different emperors, they would grab a name that people historically would remember since they weren't powerful themselves to make you think of power. Like, for example, if you look at Decius is emperor in 249, and he takes over not long after Philip the Arab, who celebrates the 1,000-year anniversary of Rome. And he's a pretty weak guy, this guy Decius. So what he ends up doing is he takes the name of one of the 5 good emperors as his second name. He calls himself Decius Trajan. So he's like, oh, well, I must be as good as Trajan, right? Because I'm great. So to take a name like that and not create your own name, right? Like not create a name of power is an indicator of how you actually are. Because if you even look at the name Marcus Aurelius, the Antonine family that Aurelius comes from, that name is used so commonly, especially through the 3rd century, because people wanted to tie themselves to something that had legitimacy.
Right. That's why there's so many Caesars, right? It's because they're all...
I guess you could say that, but it shifts from being a name to a title, I think is an important way to look at it. Because even at it's very much solidified during the reforms of Diocletian, which are somewhere around 284 to 305, where he takes and puts a senior emperor in the west and a senior emperor in the east, and he gives them the name Augusti or Augustus. So there's 2 Augustuses, and they each have junior emperors named Caesars. So it shifts from being a name to a title, and I think that really comes from the idea of the legitimacy of the first emperor being, Augustus Caesar. Which, funny enough, that wasn't his name by birth either. His name by birth was Gaius Octavianus, right? So he's Gaius Octavius. And when he's in the will of Julius Caesar, he adopts this guy Octavius, who's his great nephew. And so obviously he's going to take that name now because it gives him legitimacy. So legitimacy is a big part of why these actions are taken.
Right. Was Marcus Aurelius really the last effective kind of emperor? And I think he was done in 180 AD. Is that really true?
Yes and no, right? And the thing you have to look at is there are some effective emperors throughout the 3rd century. So the one I can point to who's very effective is a guy named Aurelian. And Aurelian is in the 270s. I think he dies somewhere around 274. But he's this military guy that takes Rome by the sword, names himself emperor. But the thing that Rome is dealing with in this point in time is it started to crumble and become a much smaller version of itself. So you have the barbarians coming in and pushing in the north. The Western Roman Empire breaks off, and a Roman general breaks off and makes it his own empire, which is called the Gallic Empire. And then you have in the East breaks off and becomes the Palmyrene Empire. So the actual central Rome that he's in charge of is much, much smaller. So in a several year period, he reconquers the West, the Gallic Empire. He reconquers the East, the Palmyrene Empire. And then he also manages to push off a lot of the barbarians. The problem is his reward is being assassinated by his secretary, right? So, and then the guy that replaces him doesn't even want the job. This old guy named Tacitus ends up replacing him. He's a distant relative of the Roman historian Tacitus, ends up being the next emperor, and he's very quickly killed in battle as well. So there are good emperors, if that makes sense, like people that could rule and could structurally manage the thing, but there's so much upheaval that it's very hard to hold that position and hold it for very long effectively. And that's why if you look at Diocletian, why he reforms the empire in the way he does, a lot of what he does actually sets up feudal Europe. And a lot of the terms he's used. So I guess to kind of take a step back, when historians look at the Roman Empire, they divide it into two periods. The first period is called the Principate. So that's everything up to Diocletian. And then everything from Diocletian to 476 is called the Dominate. Principate comes from the word that Augustus called himself. He didn't want to call himself a king because people didn't like that idea. Romans, in fact, kicked out their last king, a guy named Tarquin the Proud. And he takes a title. This title is Princeps Senatus. It was like the Roman version of the Speaker of the House for the Senate. So then he calls himself the Princeps, or the Prince of Rome. And then he pulls in power from all these other titles. So historically, we call the empire from Augustus to Diocletian the Principate. After Diocletian, it becomes something very different. It's called the Dominate, and it comes from the word dominus, meaning Lord. And that idea is that somebody was now, I guess, almost a despot in a lot of ways, like somebody that had a very strong rule. And what Diocletian does is he divides the empire into a very different way to manage, because as we've seen through the 3rd century, this thing is so big, it's become hard to manage. You have all of these military threats. So he actually creates these smaller divisions called dioceses, which is where the Catholic Church gets their word from. The people in charge of these dioceses are called vicars. That's where we also get the word from that's used for an early word for priest. And so he also creates these other positions, dukes and counts, which are going to be used throughout medieval society. So he starts to develop these smaller management things to manage this empire, which has become very hard to control.
Right. So all this stuff, like the precursor to the Catholic Church, I think if I remember correctly, Gibbon, in his Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, he kind of distills everything into two issues of why Rome fell, which is Christianity and Christian ethos kind of transforming Rome, and the barbarians. But I don't think that's the case. But I think that
I agree with you. I don't think it's the case either.
Yeah, tell me
Continue
why.
though.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying that like internal stuff kind of led to it. Like it could have
Correct.
changed and morphed, or there are all kinds of different religions and paganism of all different types at Rome at the time. I don't know if they had a state religion, but probably emperor worship.
So
but
if you want to look at state religion of Rome, as a pagan empire, Rome did have their traditional pantheon of gods, but they would also borrow them from other places that they conquered. Right. So you have this god called Sol Invictus that comes in from an area near Egypt, and it comes from the unconquerable sun. Right. And that's where a guy like Aurelian actually takes Sol Invictus as his personal god. You have a lot of worship of Apollo that's going to come in from Greek society. So Romans would borrow gods from other societies. That starts to change around 311. There's the battle called Milvian Bridge, where the emperor, who's trying to basically get full power at that time, Constantine, is fighting another emperor named Maxentius. Maxentius is ruling I think the East at that point in time, or the West. I always confuse these two, but one is in charge of the East, one is in charge of the West. And at this battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine defeats Maxentius and becomes the sole emperor of the entire Roman Empire. He has a vision the night before where he supposedly sees in the sky under the sign you will conquer, and that sign that he sees is the Chi and the Rho. So he puts the Christian cross on the shields of his soldiers. They win the battle, and there's so many differing opinions on what actually happens here. But he supposedly starts to live his life as a Christian, though he's not baptized until his deathbed.
Right,
but
and he's also cutting his rivals' heads off.
He assassinates his own
yeah.
son.
Yeah,
like there's a lot of things that don't really go so well, right?
Yeah, not really Christian. I think he cut off people's heads who threatened him, and like rebels and things like that. Pretty rough.
It becomes the state religion in 380 under Diocletian or under Theodosius the Great. So a little under 100 years later, it will be the official state religion of Rome. So the reason I don't agree with Edward Gibbon on this, and if you've ever read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he gives like hundreds of reasons. It's a little obnoxious. And I think you have to understand too, in his background, Gibbon was raised Catholic, but then his father forces him to convert later on to Protestantism because of wanting to have more power in the Church of England. So in his writings, he has a lot of an axe to grind with the Catholic Church because he has a personal problem with it. So he would point to that as a reason because it's a problem for him. But if you look at the East was an entirely Christian empire and survives for almost 1,000 years longer. Now, I don't think that Christianity is the reason it survives. I think monetary policy is the actual reason it survives. Because as I mentioned, we have this inflation problem. One of the things that Constantine does, but doesn't get a ton of credit for, is around 314, he mints a few gold coins. And until he dies in 336, he's going to mint gold coins every single year until the East is actually on a full gold standard.
Wow.
And that's going to go till about the year 1000, until the Great Schism, without inflation. So that is something you really could look at of why the East survives so much longer. If Gibbon was right and it was Christianity, well, the East would have crashed pretty quickly after the West, right? But the East is also easier to defend because Constantinople was harder to invade. So there is a lot of other things you could look at.
Yeah, lasted to the 15th century, right? So at least, the Orthodox.
1553.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting.
But it's a city-state by that time is a thing you have to understand, right? Because there's a few things that happen during that time period. They start to lose power on their own a little bit. But then also the Pope says, hey, let's have a crusade where we sack Constantinople, which is our own territory. So it really becomes more of a city-state than a country by the time it falls to the Ottomans in 1453.
It's kind of a sick man at that point because the Romans went in and took all their money. Talk about monetary policy. They sacked Constantinople, took all the money, and then Constantinople doesn't have reserves to pay for, troops and things like that. So they're rendered weak.
Well, and technology changes are a big part of that as well, because around this time, cannons start being used a lot more. And it kind of doesn't matter how big your walls are at that point in time if you have cannons. And there's a kind of a legend around this. So I can't say this is true, but it's an interesting story that there's a Hungarian by the name of Orban, funny enough, which is the name of the current guy in charge, who's actually a munitions expert and builds a cannon and offers it to the ruler of Constantinople at that time, who declines it. So then this guy Orban goes to the Muslim Turks and he goes, so how about a cannon, right? And it becomes one of the big reasons they end up taking down these walls is because they had the power of cannons.
Wow, interesting. So yeah, they didn't keep up with technology. Interesting.
Yeah.
But it really does apply to today. This kind of irresponsible leadership, I mean, is you can extrapolate that to the present day life of like our money's almost worthless, inflation. You're right, though. I think 1913, it really is an important date in the
It's pivotal.
Yeah. And that's under Wilson too. Who, like, I think he said, I made a terrible mistake.
It's the funny thing about Wilson too is like there's so many bad things that happen under Wilson, but at the same time, you can blame Teddy Roosevelt for so much of it, because at the same time, if he doesn't run as the Bull Moose Party and divide the Republican vote, there's a good chance that Wilson doesn't win.
Right. Right. It is interesting. And then, I mean, there's rumors that Wilson actually was poisoned and put into a coma, and his wife ran like the country for a
So
year or two. Have you heard
I
that?
don't know about the poisoning part. The thing that is actually true is in the last year of his life, he has a stroke. This does
Right.
actually happen. And his wife is actually at that point in time running the country. As a lot of the League of Nations and things like that are occurring, a lot of those things, because he was on a tour at the time of the United States because there wasn't a lot of support for the League of Nations. So he goes on a speaking tour of the country to try and get support for the League of Nations. During this tour, he has the stroke, and his wife continues a lot of the governing until he passes. So I don't know about the poisoning portion, but there is truth to the fact that he did have a stroke and his wife was leading the country.
I've heard that rumor. I don't. It's not provable. Please don't hold me on that. I'm just saying it was very fortunate for these malefactors to get all this stuff into, the country, and then all of a sudden renders sick. He comes
Yeah.
up. It's much more common. I mean, I think Biden's wife was whoever was running during Biden's and rubber stamping stuff, and
There
Jill
was a
shows it.
congresswoman in
Yeah,
Texas. I don't know if you saw this. This is like maybe 3 or 4 months ago that they went and checked on her, and she was like in an old folks home, and she
yeah,
just
I've
hadn't
heard
showed
that
up.
too.
So it's like the one of the problems we do have is we do have a geriatric ruling class, which is
Yeah,
not a great position to be in.
they never expected these people to just stay in office forever, so they didn't write
Yeah,
any rules about it. They just
correct.
like their mentality was, why would you do this your whole life? It wasn't a career view, it was like a landed gentry view. So
Yeah.
the next iteration of the United States, if there is one, they're going to have to do term limits or age limits or something like that. These like some of these people are in really bad shape. I think she's one of many, but I don't
Yeah.
know if Biden was even making decisions. He might have been
Well,
bedridden.
did you hear the story about the auto pen?
Yeah,
Jeff
absolutely.
Jeff Zeiss, I think was the guy's name. That I forget his actual position as it relates to the Biden White House, but it supposedly, and he has a big CCP connection as well. He was the guy that was deciding on who was going to actually get pardoned, right? And they were using auto pen to pardon it. So that's a scary thing to think of because I didn't vote for Jeff Zeiss. I don't know about you.
No, I didn't either. He made a lot of decisions on COVID and
Hmm.
all this stuff. Like it's really weird. It's almost like you had somebody who was like a kid, somebody else is running the show.
Yeah.
And there's a 13-year-old emperor or something. He doesn't even know what he's doing. It's crazy. I mean, these things do happen in civilizations. It was supposed the whole thing is that all these lessons we're talking about today were supposed to be remedied by the people who started this country, right? They
Yeah.
looked at the Roman history and went, okay, how do we keep this stuff from happening?
Well, and I think the thing too is there are solutions. That the problem is the solutions wouldn't really benefit the people in power. I think is the bigger problem because you would have to solve the currency, and they're not really willing to do that because at the same time, a lot of the laws they make benefit themselves where they're creating inflation.
Right.
The other thing as well is we have to fix. We don't really produce anything here anymore, and I think we've seen that a little bit in the last year or so where some production is starting to come back here. But if we're going to do anything about the currency and we haven't first fixed how we produce things, well, the economy is going to crash, right? So I think we have to solve that. But then also it goes back to what you were talking about. We have to solve elected officials because they aren't meant to be in these positions as long as they are, and they don't answer to the people that voted for them. So unless we solve these things, we are going in a very similar direction. Now, as I said, granted, we don't have armies raising up against each other well yet,
Yeah.
but
Right.
we do have this inflationary problem, this immigration problem, and I don't know how to describe central power right now. Like I'd like to think the president's in charge, but it really doesn't even seem like that.
It doesn't. And I think there's corruption too. I mean, also a lot of civilizations go down from corruption, but here in California, the state is super corrupt. Like there's billions of dollars missing, and nobody's really interested in finding out where it went, which I think is
They're more
really
interested in
critical.
giving reparations and making you pay, which there wasn't slavery in California, but they're making you apparently pay for it.
There were like 10,000 black people in California in 1900. So after the
Yeah.
Civil War, like this
Yeah.
is not a slave state. The state barely was
But it's one of
populated.
the things Gavin Newsom's cared about the most, and it's
I
come up,
know
I
it's
think, even
just
in San
true.
Francisco. But it's like our cities are crumbling. How about we
Yeah.
worry about that?
Yeah, what's that fundamental? I mean, I think that goes into this whole issue, overarching issue of our discussion. What civilization do we have? What
Hmm.
has happened in the past? And what civilization do we want? Because I don't want this current civilization. It's not
Hmm.
working. I mean, you talk about buying off of the military. we're spending $1 trillion to keep these guys doing whatever and pointing them out away from the United States. It's incredible.
Well,
I mean,
I would agree with that. And I think that the problem is too is the problem to that is a lot deeper than people understand as well. Like I think people hear the idea of foreign aid and they're like, well, why are we giving money to other countries? And part of that is true, but the part that isn't, that people aren't aware of, is a lot of that money is actually given to government contractors of people that are producing things here to then be sent to those countries. Right. So it's like kind of the military industrial complex. If we cut that funding, itself would crumble. So there's this other Leviathan trying to preserve itself too.
Right. No, it's incredible. I mean, it's just like the size of it. It's probably, that's the whole problem with the Roman Empire, was so big. I mean, imagine having to do all that stuff without high technology and manage everything. I mean, there's road building and aqueducts and all that stuff, but still, it's still a vast empire.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like we really are a global empire. The US has really achieved something.
I would agree with that. And I think it's more of a post World War II thing. There's kind of the conversation that after World War II, we kind of shifted into being something called the liberal world order. And that's the idea that, well, we don't want another world war, so we have to create all these other groups to prevent it. And what ends up happening is people start to lose their sovereignty because of that, right? Because it becomes a bad thing to have nationalism and a bad thing to have a nation. Though those things before the Second World War weren't bad words, right? Now, certain people in the Second World War did bad things to create a bad connotation for them. But to have a national identity is not a bad thing. And we're really destroying our countries is part of the thing we're seeing. It's
really incredible. Like how many bases do we have worldwide? I know the Romans
did. No idea.
It's like 750 all over the place in different sovereign countries. And it's extraordinary the way the U.S. has expanded. But it seems like it has to contract. I don't know how we're going to pay off our debt. Or do anything. They're going to try to turn it into some type of crypto fund and just write it off wholesale. I don't know.
That really worries me too. Like, could you imagine, like, so William, this is the part of the debt you're responsible for. Good luck. And we're going to keep spending money. So have fun.
Right. I mean, I don't know how they're going to get away from that. They're going to do some kind of 3-card Monte type thing to get away from all that stuff. I mean, I think one of the big changes too has to be getting off the gold standard. I think you mentioned 1913.
Well, under Nixon, that was a problem.
Yeah, under Nixon, yeah. I think that's a mistake. That whole thing you were talking about at the beginning of our discussion, the keeping on the gold standard by Constantine, is the smartest thing, because then the actual inflation usually hurts the lower and middle classes, like, because the upper classes have income, so that whatever it's coming, it just inflates. But people who have savings and everything get hosed. There's no incentive to save because your money gets less and less value. That's why gold tied currencies, or what do they call them, stable coins now?
That's kind of out of my realm of understanding. Yeah. I've kind of kept my distance a little bit on crypto because it kind of concerns me that somebody wrote a white paper. We don't know who he is, but we should definitely use this thing. I don't know. I guess that's the conspiracy theorist in me.
It's still electronic, guys. You have to assume that all this, like, infrastructure stays current and untainted or anything like that. But the idea of a stable coin is that it's a coin tied to actual, tangible, real world things. So yeah, it doesn't kind of go up and down. So it's a little different than like Bitcoin or something like that. But
well, because my bigger concern with electronic currency, which is funny because I know most of our currency is electronic at this point in time, but the thing that worries me is we have shut your money off. You are a very bad citizen. When you become a good citizen, we will give you your money back. You know what I mean? Like that's really concerning to me.
It should be. I mean, there's already kind of doing that. I think censorship was part of that too.
Like even the self-driving car. Like, come on, we are now taking you to the police station. What? Yeah, where am I going?
You're lucky if it's just a police station. Holy smokes! Like you get some of these bad actors in there, get a Caligula or something like that, or a Nero, and it's like, who knows what's going on? It's interesting. Commodus was like, wasn't he kind of like a dandy? He didn't even care about being an emperor at all. Like he was just like,
well, he did to the point that it gave him power, but day to day he liked the idea of being an emperor, but he was kind of a wimp about it. Because number one, he knows a gladiator is never going to kill the emperor, so that's not going to happen. And then when he was fighting animals in the arena, they gave him a little platform to do it from, so his life wouldn't actually be threatened doing it. Like, you know what I mean? It's like those rich people that go to Africa and they're like, oh, I shot an antelope or something like that. And it's like, yeah, but you were in a helicopter. So it's
Right.
like it's kind of this weird faux reality. And one of the final things that Commodus was actually going to do before he died, and was kind of the last straw, is he was going to rename Rome in his own name. He was going to
Wow.
call it, I think, Comitia Canadonia or something like that. He was actually going to rename Rome in relation to himself.
Fascinating. That's the other thing, is you get these people who are corrupt or something like that. Like, I think Trump has a little bit of an element of it too, is like this kind of malignant narcissism and stuff like that. Like, it's just the civilization itself. Like, I don't know.
I think they
I
all kind of have it though, right? At the
think
same
you're right.
time, because
Yeah,
how do you get to one of those extreme positions of power without being willing to sacrifice your self integrity? Honestly, I
good
just don't
point.
see it.
I think you're absolutely right. Jeremy, we are at the 45-minute mark.
Yeah.
Great talk. Thanks for sharing all your knowledge. What else are you working on, and where can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm working on a book on the Roman Empire that's going to be out later next year. I'm actually working on it with, believe it or not, my graduate advisor. Him and I have gotten together to put together a really cool book on the Roman Empire.
Awesome.
The bigger thing that we're always working on is I'm responsible for getting big messages out there so that we can kind of, turn the tide of what's happening out there, right? I don't want to see Rome decline and fall like our civilization decline and fall like Rome, right? So what we do at Command Your Brand is we help big messages of entrepreneurs that are really shifting society to get out there. So I put together a great resource for people called Command Your Empire. If they go to commandyourempire.com, which will teach them how to use the forces of PR for good, right? Because there are people that use it for bad. I want to show people how to use it for good and preserve their empire. So that's commandyourempire.com. And also, I'm always creating content over at Jeremy Roman Empire and the Jeremy Ryan Slate Show.
Right. So people, I'll put links to all that stuff in the show notes, so people can check out your stuff. You have like 1,500 episodes, I think, on your podcast, and a lot on the Roman Empire, and then you have another YouTube channel in addition to this, right?
Well, so we have the company channel, which is the Command Your Brand channel. My podcast channel is Jeremy Ryan Slate Pod, and then this one, which is Jeremy Roman Empire.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you got a lot of things going on. 4.9 rating. That's pretty good. So congrats on that.
Thank you.
But again, the guest full name is Jeremy Ryan Slate. And we covered the Roman Empire, and there are definite parallels, guys. There's just some uncomfortable parallels. People, be safe out there, and try to hold our civilization together. I think we're really at that point. Like,
I agree.
I took it for granted, but like, that's the real issue now. Some of these other issues are actually molehills compared to kind of what's going on now. So, Jeremy, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thanks for having me. And I have a tendency to drone on, so I hope I didn't do that too much today.
No.
I hope people have their interest sparked so they go out and find out for themselves. Don't take what I said for fact. Go out and find your own facts and start to study this stuff, because it is really important.
Amen. I thought you were great. Thanks so much. Stay there.
Thank you.
Stay there. Stay there.